Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's a delight to be with you, of course, with two really fabulous and eminent guests. This is one of several Business Maverick, Daily Maverick webinars, and we've been focusing on an enormous number of very wide topics, some to do with the COVID crisis, some broader than that. And this particular one, we are sort of halfway between those 2 points. I have with me the main topic of our discussion today is a book, Africa First, written by Jakkie Cilliers, and we have a moderator in Ottilia Maunganidze. Didn't pronounce that correct, even though I've practiced. Jakkie Cilliers, as you South Africans will be very familiar, as the founder and former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies. He's now on heads the board of trustees for the Institute, and is head of the Africa Futures and Innovation Program within the ISS. Ottilia is joined in the ISS in 2009. She was a legal advisor and human rights education officer. She also has a Master of Laws degree in fundamental rights litigation and international human rights from UNISA, and knows the book very well, and it has done my job several times presenting the book, so she can help with setting Jakkie right on all of the things that he's forgotten that he wrote, which will be very important. Can I just say, just as an introduction, really this is a magisterial book. It's very detailed. It's not it's described as a roadmap to economic growth in South Africa. It's very detailed. It covers a huge number of areas. There's no simple solutions. It doesn't. There's no kind of rah. I've got the one magic wand that can solve everything. And it's a very clear-eyed view of our future. Sometimes has some details which are really uncomfortable and quite, but important to focus on, as we'll discuss. And it provides, I think, an excellent background and context for what's occupying everybody's minds at the moment, which is the COVID crisis, and we'll get to that. But Jakkie, obviously, you've spoken about the book a lot. You've probably been through these questions over and over again. But tell me why you called it Africa First. I mean, I should also mention that you're a veteran Africanophile. You've traveled across the continent for now decades. You've seen enormous changes firsthand. You have this enormous resource base, not only in the Institute, but also in the people. I can't help noticing that this guy, what's his name? President Cyril Ramaphosa has given you an endorsement on the book. That was quite an achievement in itself. And he's very complimentary about the book. But tell us about Africa First. Oh yes, and here's what it looks like. Thank you very much for that.
Tim, thanks very much, and thanks for the kind words. So yes, I got a very nice quote from President Ramaphosa on the front cover, and the title went forward and backward. Ottilia and I had some interesting debates about. I wanted to call it what was Trump's. Ottilia, what was the Make Africa Great Again is what I wanted to call it, but I was overruled. So Africa First, it's really about what needs to happen in Africa to ignite a growth revolution. And I was President Ramaphosa was very kind to provide a quote for the front cover. Yeah, the decision on the title is always a debate between you and the publishers, Jonathan Ball, on the book.
Yes, but why Africa First? Are you thinking about that we should place Africa first in our minds, that we should think about Africa continentally? What does the first part refer to?
It is, because that's where I stay. And if Africa is to develop, it's up to Africans. It's up to us. Nobody else is going to develop Africa. And if we want to focus, instead of looking to the Chinese, the Cubans, or whomever else, it really is about Africans placing Africa first. And they haven't always. If you look at the leadership in Africa over many years, it's often been quite a challenge. So Africa First is about Africans placing Africa first, particularly our leadership, focusing on the development of the continent and not on taking their money offshore and all kinds of other factors.
Alrighty, and I was saying earlier that your understanding of Africa is not rose-tinted. Maybe you can show us the first graph and tell us about the crocodile jaws of African development. Really, this is the starting point of the discussion, is where we stand now.
Yeah, so this is a slide that shows average levels of income in Africa in 2018 US dollars from 1990 until 2020, and then continues with a forecast out until 2040. So it shows a widening gap between the green line at the bottom, which is the average income in Africa, and the blue line at the top, which is the average income for the rest of the world. And the story is very evident. In 1990, average incomes in Africa was about 45% that of the rest of the world. It's now around 27%, and by 2040 it will be about 23%. And that is despite the fact that we forecast Africa to grow at about 4.6% average. That's all of Africa's 55 countries, and the growth rate in the rest of the world to be much lower at 3%. But that gap in average incomes really is what drove me. And the book is really about three questions. And this is: where does Africa find itself today in relation to the rest of the world? And what explains that? And that's without taking a kind of a rose-tinted, where do we want Africa to be? And I forecast and model using a modeling platform hosted at the University of Denver of where I think Africa will be in 2040, and then look at what can be done to improve this trajectory and create a better tomorrow. So that, in essence, is really what the book is about. It's about that simple graph. And I've used that graph very often at the start of most of my presentations, just to show what is the challenges that lie ahead for the continent.
Yes, I mean, you do point out, which was a shock to me. And I should mention to people, one of the characteristics of this book is the great models that you have presented, and the very interesting exercise in itself, the whole modeling effort and the whole predictive exercise that you go through in this book. It's really fascinating to read. One of the things that you point out is that South Africa will miss the Development Goals 2030 poverty goal, really by a considerable margin. The graph does show that what we all know, that Africa as a continent is growing faster. We are improving everywhere, and yet poverty is still increasing. That's it's a bit of a cold shower when you think about it that way.
Yeah,
that you can be improving and at the same time just explain why that happens and how it happens.
So I've pulled that graph up on the screen. So it's 2015 till 2040. The dark green band at the bottom is the number of Africans that will live in extreme poverty out till 2040. And you'll see that band, which is peaks at about 500 million people on the left-hand side, stays relatively constant. And the light green, on top of that, on the stacked area graph, is the rest of Africa's population. And then there's a black line which speaks to the right-hand side of the graph, which is the percent of Africans that will live in extreme poverty. So that comes down from about 35% to about 27% by 2040. So it's a story where the number of Africans that live in extreme poverty at the current, what we refer to as the current path, is more or less going to remain constant at about 500 million people well into beyond 2030. And goal 1 of the Sustainable Development Goals is to reduce extreme poverty in the world to 0. Now, clearly, Africa is going to miss this with a huge margin if it carries on as it is carrying on at the moment. And we refer to this as the current path forecast. So this is a rather dismal forecast, but if you look at the light green size of the rest of Africa's population, you'll see that one of the reasons why Africa will not eliminate poverty is because we have a very rapidly growing population. With so many young Africans coming onto the job market and so on, it's very difficult really to grow rapidly enough to rapidly reduce poverty. So this is a fundamental, I think, forecast that shows where Africa is headed if it doesn't change its ways.
Right. And which is a good moment to say, to talk about your 11 interventions. Can you just quickly go through them and tell us where they are, and we'll come back to then we can sort of talk about the individual aspects that you mentioned in the book.
Yes, so I've pulled up a slide which is, so there's 16 chapters in the book, and 11 of those chapters are where I model a specific interventions. I start with modeling a demographic dividend. Africa is about 30 years away from getting to its demographic dividend. So what would be a more rapid demographic transition in Africa? I look at what would be the impact of improving the rollout of basic infrastructure, that is water, sanitation, health, which is particularly today with COVID very important. What would be the impact of improving education levels? What would an agricultural revolution mean for Africa? What can social grants do? In South Africa, we already have 18 million South Africans on social grants, because Africa will struggle to alleviate poverty and to reduce inequality without social grants, particularly if it industrializes, which is the next, there's a whole chapter on what I refer to as Made in Africa, the challenge and the opportunity that lies with an industrialization strategy. And then there's a chapter on leapfrogging. What is the potential for leapfrogging to change Africa's prospects? The fourth industrial revolution, digitization. Then there's a chapter on the potential impact of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area that starts this year. It is supposed to be fully implemented by 2034. What is that impact when we trade across Africa? There's a chapter on trends on silencing the guns. What is the impact of peace? You know, we think that Africa will remain turbulent partly because it is developing. So instability and development in a sense go hand in hand. Then there's a chapter on the impact of improved governance that I also look at the contribution that democracy makes to growth. And the sad reality is that at low levels of development, democracy makes no difference to economic growth, but it makes a huge contribution to all kinds of other things. And there's a chapter on foreign direct investment, aid and remittances. So these are 11 scenarios. There's a chapter on each. And I eventually put them together. And I sort of say, so what would be the combined, if all good things come together, what would be the combined impact of those 11 interventions on Africa? And there's also a chapter on the future of jobs in Africa and the impact on climate change, of carbon emissions under these different scenarios, where I compare their impact across the continent.
All righty, thanks for that very concise breakdown of what's in the book. Ottilia, I've left you alone up to now so that I can give Jakkie a chance to explain what he was been writing about, but you're an expert in peace and security and democratization. Could you give us your perspectives on those two aspects? So these are two of the 11 interventions that Jakkie was talking about. Both of them are fantastically important. Maybe we should start with peace and security. I mean, I was interested to see that actually Africa is becoming a more peaceful continent. But there is this. It's from a military kind of perspective, but there are also more protests in African countries all over the place, and especially in urban contexts. Fill us in.
Thanks a lot, Tim, and thanks, Jakkie, for introducing your book and the various interventions. Tim, I know that you've asked me to speak specifically about peace and security, but I don't think it's possible to have a conversation around peace and security on the African continent while leaving everything else out. When you ask your question, for example, about the protests, those are protests that are rooted in socioeconomic issues that people in various African countries are facing. So when we have a discussion around where peace, security, and stability fits into what I like to call almost a jigsaw puzzle of making Africa, Jakkie, I'm not going to say great again because I'm not a trumpet, but making and putting Africa first, we have to recognize those important fundamental things that ensure stability. So Jackie's book, which is what I think is really good about it, is it looks at all those interventions separately and then it brings them together and it puts them in a space where you ask yourself, can you have peace and security when the population is lacking in education, social assistance, lacking in employment, for example, which is an issue across the African continent? And the answer is not quite. So we can have a semblance of peace and stability in countries where the social stresses that people are facing are there, but we cannot, and I say this, and I want to stress this point, we cannot do that while leaving everything else behind. And I'll end on this point around, the work that we do at the Institute, which is around promoting and advancing human security. It recognizes all of these things as instrumental cogs in building a better system, in building, the kind of stable environment we want. We can have a conversation now about the African Continental Free Trade Area, but how much free trade can we really have if some countries are still in conflict? So we need to ensure that those places are safer, secure, and in a peaceful environment so that we can be able to ignite the kind of growth that Jakkie talks about.
Thanks for that. It is, of course, it's one of the interesting parts of this book is how integrated everything is, as you say. It's one aspect of this, of African development, really, they are all contingent on each other. And they are all, as you point out, I think, Jakkie, in the book somewhere, they tend to boost each other. So if you make small improvements in one area, say education, then it tends to reflect also on the others. Jakkie, maybe you could talk a little bit about the implementation of the African FTA, since it's since Ottilia did raise it. What effect will that have? What are you hopeful about it? What kind of timescales are we looking at?
The implementation.
Ottilia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Since Jackie's silent for us, maybe you can talk a little bit about the FTA.
So, yesterday, as the Institute, we released a short opinion piece around the fact that the African Continental Free Trade Area and the ambitions out of it are going to be delayed because of COVID-19. And
right.
One of the key issues that comes up in that is which is the case like right now, when you restrict movement within the continent and out of the continent, trade is going to be a difficult thing to push for. At the same time, and I think this goes without saying, once we're out of this, let's say this dark cloud that we're under, the African Continental Free Trade Area is definitely going to be one of the things that helps to push for the growth on the African continent. And Jackie's book touches on this quite a lot, which is that African Continental Free Trade is almost that key that helps to unlock Africa's potential. And the reason is simple. When you look at other continents, let's look at Europe, for example, the intra-European trade has helped to trigger and sustain growth on that continent. When you compare with Asia, the level of, and that increase, if I can put it that way, in trade between Asian countries has done the same. Now we turn to Africa, where at the moment our trade among ourselves sits at under 20%. And so we are trading more outside of the continent than we are within the continent. And by trading more outside of the continent, we help other regions to develop and to get the kind of economic growth that we need on the continent. So the vision, I think, on the African Continental Free Trade Area is allow for African countries to do more trade with themselves. And let's face it, a lot of what we are trading on the international markets now, some of it, the primary resources for that come from the African continent, whether it's through our mining or other or agricultural trade, for example. So we need to do more to trade internally on the continent than out of the continent. I see that Jackie's back, and I think it's important that he gets in at this point.
Yes, you are.
And you guys,
we were just talking there a little bit about the African Free Trade Area proposal. Which really seems, I mean, it is a very hopeful thing. And it would be an enormous step forward. And in a way, I always think about this, that it's a good time to implement it now, before there's too many vested interests involved. You know, you can, in a sort of perverse kind of way, you can use the fact that African intra-Africa trade is low at the moment, you know, to make the big policy shift. Because if you leave it too long, then you know, countries start earning income from tariffs, and then it's, you know, then they have to struggle to give it up. You know, to extent that that does apply to us a little bit here. I mean, the related topic is, and this is very interesting, I think, in the book too, was about industrialization. Maybe we could head there a little bit. I mean. Industrialization in South Africa, in Africa, has declined over the past 15 years or so. There was a sort of a little bit of a bump, but it's made African countries more reliant on primary resources as a, you know, as an export earner, which in a way is, it's got the wheel spinning a little bit in the wrong direction. Are you hopeful about manufacturing? And if we can't do that, then what are the alternatives?
So the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area where you started is absolutely fundamental. Africa does not have large enough markets. Different to India and China and the United States and even Europe, you need a large enough African free trade area so that businesses can establish themselves, so that manufacturing that is located in Africa has a large enough internal market. And absolutely critical that Africa trade with itself, because as Tim, as you probably know, regional trade has a much higher value content than trade with the rest of the world. And one of the ways for Africa to manufacture, to go up the manufacturing escalator, as we refer to it, is through regional integration. So the African Continental Free Trade Area, the Secretariat was stood up this year in Ghana. It's headed by a South African. And by 2034, Africa is supposed to have provided that 97% of all goods traded in Africa will be tariff-free. This is going to be a difficult process, because what is going to happen is that in the initial years of the implementation of the African Free Trade Area, in other words, the next few years, many countries are going to suffer quite a tariff loss, because suddenly they implement zero tariffs or reduce tariffs on their exports. And this is going to present many African countries with a big challenge. It has often in the past led to the failure of arrangements such as the East African Free Trade Area. So this whole issue of the Continental Free Trade Area is foundational to changing Africa's growth prospects and to the manufacturing of Africa. So absolutely fundamental.
Alrighty, let's there's lots more to talk about, obviously, and we'll probably pick them up in questions. But Ottilia, you did mention the effect of COVID, of the COVID crisis. I just to give you some stats. This is today's figures. The number of confirmed COVID-19 positive cases is now 4.5 million. It's extraordinary. But Africa is really a very small portion of that. It's 61,000. And of that 61,000, 10% is in the Cape. It's the SADC region has 19,000. So South Africa is definitely, the focus of the crisis at the moment. Obviously, the economic effects are going to be harsh, but do you see, first of all, how bad do you think they will be, is there anything that we can see that positive that might come out of this? That will it change African trajectory in some way? What's your gut instinct?
Is this question to me or to Jakkie?
Yes, to you. To you for a start. I think both of you, if you like.
All right. Well, the impact of COVID-19 should not be underestimated. And while you raise the issue around the proportion of African cases versus the rest of the world, it doesn't change that Africa doesn't live in isolation. And I think one of the things that has been quite important, even in the responses on the African continent, is trying as much as possible to save lives and livelihoods. So while a country may have fewer cases, for example, it doesn't mean that countries have not imposed certain restrictions, particularly in respect of movement, recognizing our limited capacity. So when we look at, and we can't compare, let's say, a country that has sufficient ICU beds, we cannot compare it with directly, if I can put it that way, with a country with insufficient ICU beds, because the impact that a lesser number of cases would have on that population would still be high. And I think going away, I'm not much of a numbers person, let me be frank, but going away from the numbers a bit and looking at the impact that we are already seeing in here in South Africa, on the rest of the continent, off COVID-19. We've seen, for example, an increase in food insecurity that has seen the Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as the World Health Organization, push for a plea to get more money injected to advance food security on the African continent. Why does Africa matter when we talk about food security? When Jakkie was presenting earlier, he raised the point around poverty and around the fact that realistically, and let's be frank, the African continent, when we're talking about hunger, is the continent that is most affected. So while COVID-19 itself might not be the thing that affects African countries more, the related issues will. And that is the fact that we will see more people out of jobs. We will see a lot more people in abject poverty, and we will see people going hungry. But and I think I'll hand over to Jakkie, who's a much more numbers person than I am. But we do see a kickback almost. So we see countries bouncing back after. But I think the test will be, at which point do countries bounce back, and how can we be able to assist in ensuring that that happens, and that the impact isn't long term, but it's just short term.
Yeah,
Tom, so if I
mean, it's very interesting in the.
That.
Yeah, please do. Just can I just mention just quickly? I mean, one of the interesting parts of the book I thought was you did talk about the reason why I was talking about. It seems very doesn't seem very instinctive, but sometimes it does take something like this to really shake people's perceptions up and increase the urgency. I mean, it is interesting that in African development, the countries that have developed fastest over the last decade have been Ethiopia and
Rwanda.
And Rwanda, yeah, and both of which have had these, very big shocks to their system. Maybe I'm just grabbing at straws, but anyway, sorry, Jakkie, please go ahead.
It's a very important point you make. In actual fact, I've done quite a bit of work on forecasting democracy and this kind of stuff. And the reality is that many countries that have gone through a traumatic experience, Rwanda with the Rwandan genocide and Ethiopia with the Red Terror, have created a governing elite that is focused towards growth and never again. And the same, by the way, holds for China and for South Korea and so on and so forth. So that that change has a huge impact on the orientation of the governing elite. And that orientation of the governing elite is much more important than the institutional setting, democracy or not a democracy. But if you are an authoritarian government and at low levels of development, in actual fact, authoritarianism, unfortunately, probably delivers more rapid results if you have the right governing elite. And many times in Africa, you don't. But Tim, I wanted just to carry on to the COVID point. I put up a slide here that just made the point that the unfolding of COVID in Africa is still quite uncertain. We are at the moment midway through a project where we are forecasting and looking at the impact of COVID on Africa. And Africa is going from about a forecast of 2.6% growth in 2020 to minus 3% growth. And we think that what will happen this year is we are going to see about 136,000 additional COVID-related deaths, plus about 26,000 deaths from other causes, hunger, poverty, and so on. But over time, the impact of COVID will decline because maybe we find a vaccine, but the impact of increased poverty, inequality will increase. And therefore, over the 5, 6, 7, 10 years, the impact of the growth reduction will have a much larger impact. So this year, only in 2020, we expect Africa's GDP to shrink by about $170 billion. Average incomes will decline by about $250 per person for Africa's 1.3 billion people. 15 million Africans will fall into extreme poverty. And as I've said, there'll be 162,000 additional deaths. That's what our tentative forecasting is telling us. And these are terrible facts. They are not facts, they are forecasts. But the prognosis for COVID's impact on Africa is severe.
Wow, that is kind of shocking. I mean, strange enough, the African death rate is in most places, I think it does vary. I mean, Africa does have an advantage in having a young population on average, and the virus does affect particularly older people. So there's a little bit of a plus there, but it doesn't make it any more palatable, of course.
Yeah, median age in Africa is about 19, and average in the rest of the world, in Europe, for example, it's about 45. And that age differential has a huge impact, particularly on the severity of COVID. And that, I think, plays a big factor, together with geography and climate change and a variety of other factors, in how deadly our mortality rates related to COVID.
Right. Let's talk to some questions, because in fact there is one question on the subject of population growth, and this is a topic in your book too. I mean, you in your more hopeful scenario, you talk about how the rate of population growth will decline as the economy, the African economy as a whole improves. Is this controversial? I mean, are you suggesting that from a policy standpoint, African governments shouldn't concentrate on increasing the fertility rate, or are you saying that this is a natural consequence of economic development?
So I spend a whole chapter in the book looking at Africa's demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is the relationship of working age people, 15 to 64, to dependents, children below 15, elderly above 64. If that relationship grows and increases to a rate of about 1.7, working age people to dependents, you enter a sweet spot in growth. That factor made a huge contribution to the growth of China and the Asian tigers, for example. Africa only enters that sweet spot at about 2050. So we are 3 decades away from entering our demographic dividend. So many politicians and commentators point to Africa's young growing population as an inevitable boon. But if that is the case, then why is Africa the poorest continent in the world? The reality is simply that because you have so many children coming through your educational system that you have to provide with schooling, with teachers, with water and sanitation, you cannot invest in those kids that are already in the system. So you need to be able to do that. You have to reduce the number of children that come through the system. So I base my findings really on economics. There are 3 contributions to growth: labor, capital, and technology. Labor, the size of your working age population relative to your dependents is very important. That's where Africa's potential is. But we have such high total fertility rates that we can't keep up. So I do speak in the book and write about the importance of accelerating the demographic dividend by reducing total fertility rates. That has to do with political leadership, with female education, and of course making contraceptives more readily available. But it is a way of Africa advancing the way that it goes through its demographic transition, also accompanied by more rapid urbanization and other kind of factors. But it's very important for the continent, if it wants to accelerate growth rates, to move more rapidly through that transition.
Good enough. Ottilia, there's a question here for you from Louise Colvin. She asks, poverty and safety. Poverty is a safety and security issue. What emanates from the domestic violence, addiction, and homelessness? There's also, sorry, can I throw one other question in there? It's about corruption and poor governance. Sorry. What do you make of the progress in Africa regarding corruption and governance?
Tim, could you rephrase the first question, please? It's not clear to me.
Yes, it's. I think the question is really about what contribution does the domestic violence, addiction, and homelessness play in decreasing the sort of context of safety and security, of the safety and security issue as a whole. I mean, right. I would say it's. I mean, I guess it's crucial, isn't it? I mean, it's a. All of them are, you know, in some ways, you're more vulnerable in Africa now, not to bullets from a, you know, invading army, but from homelessness and addiction.
All right, so 2 things. It's 2 questions, separate ones. The one is around crime and violence and its impact then on everything that we've been talking about. And this is just not limited to crime and violence outside of the home, but also crime and violence in intimate spaces. The second one that I'll also respond to is the issue around corruption, misgovernance, and democracy within this conversation. So on the first, and Tim, you've kind of already answered it, which is that all of the, whether it's domestic violence or intimate partner violence, violence within families and within communities, does have an impact on social cohesion, which has an impact on our ability to be able to do the work that we need to do together. And I think one of the things that we've seen, not just on the African continent, but even globally, is the impact that crime and violence has on communities overall. And I think I said earlier that in our efforts to build, or rather to fuel trade, to fuel development, and to fuel continental prosperity, we mustn't lose sight of these things that some people might consider to be lesser issues. We do need to be able to build that strong base, that strong community base as well. And that does mean responding to issues of homelessness, responding to issues of domestic violence, and overall crime and violence within a society. And one of the programs at the ISS that we have is on justice and violence prevention, because we recognize that you cannot have sustainable forms of justice without pushing for violence prevention within that society as well. On the second point around corruption then, corruption, it goes without saying, and I'm going to say it very bluntly, corruption steals from the very vulnerable people that we're talking about. It takes away the potential of any society and any country to be able to use those resources for better. And so corruption is something that essentially frustrates ongoing good processes, and it's something that we need to address. We need to address it here in Africa, and we need to address it across the continent and across the globe. At the same time, we also need to ensure that good governance and democracy are part of that basket. It's one thing to have a conversation around the kind of development and growth that is being ignited in Rwanda, but we've also got to have an honest conversation around how much of that is at the expense of democracy and human rights. And I think ultimately we need to strike a balance. We need to strike a balance between pushing for good and sustainable development on the continent, while also ensuring that it's done for the benefit of the continent itself and the citizens of those individual African countries.
Do you see an improvement in corruption generally in Africa? I mean, in recent times, do you think corruption is on the decrease, on the increase? What's your sense?
Sorry, your question was, do you see an improvement of corruption? And I was a bit worried.
Is corruption getting more effective? Are people getting more money for their corruption? No, is there an improvement in that there's a decline in corruption?
That's a difficult question to answer, and I think Jakkie can also contribute here. What I do see, and I'll focus on that, is I see an improvement in citizen engagement and responding to corruption. Corruption is not a new thing, and in fact, a lot of our states were built on corruption in various forms. And I'm not talking about in the past 20, 30 years. I'm talking historically. Corruption has been the bedrock of the way a lot of of society's states have been built. But what I am seeing, and I say this from a personal point of view, is I'm seeing people not putting up with it, and people actually acting in response to corruption, identifying it where they see it. And I think that's a good thing, because corruption will probably be here tomorrow. It'll probably still be here in 2063. But how citizens respond to corruption and how they address issues of accountability and test those people, particularly those in government that are meant to represent our interests, test their civic service to the population. That is something that I think we need to encourage more of. Because let me tell you, a person who wants to steal from state coffers will. But if they know that they're being watched not only by their colleague, but that they're being watched by a nation, and that if they are caught, they will be, and this is the important thing, if they are caught, they will be held accountable, not just by their peers, but by the state. Then we can start to see a reduction in corruption. Corruption won't go away out of goodwill from individuals. It will go away because those that are corrupt are held to account. And that's what we need to see more of on the continent.
No, good enough. Jakkie, let's move to another. We're sort of slightly running out of time, but there is a very interesting question here from Fabian Watson. He asks, what do you think the Chinese influence currently within Africa, specifically South Africa, is? You did talk about this a little bit when you were talking about the change of trading patterns. is Chinese influence in Africa, would you say it's generally positive or generally negative?
Well, I think China is, whether it's generally positive or negative, China is very important for Africa. It is our major trading partner, and China has been the one country that has invested in building infrastructure in Africa to a significant extent, and that would not have been possible. Neither the West nor anybody else really invests in that. But China is interested in China. China will not develop Africa. Africans will develop Africa. So we need to take from China what we can. And there is a lot that China brings to Africa, but eventually the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, leapfrogging, getting through our demographic dividend, and investing in the future of the continent is what will make the difference. What I think is interesting about Chinese engagement in Africa, I think firstly it's peaked. I think we've seen the high point of Chinese engagement. China is moving towards Asia because the future of the world is much more of a regional orientation than it is towards globalization. And that also, by the way, holds for Africa. But many small Chinese companies are settling in Africa and starting to manufacture and trade in Africa, in a sense, doing import replacement. And I think that really is where Chinese engagement on the continent probably lies. I think we've seen the end of the big state-level engagement. Many African leaders look to the Chinese developmental model. But I think African populations very often look to the freedom and the democracy of the West, and that's where their orientation lies. And I think that in the book I model what I refer to as a fourth wave of democracy in Africa, because Tim, you referred to this a bit previously. Africa is more democratic than you would expect given its level of development, and Africa continues to democratize. Because Africans have generally, and I'm generalizing, I know, experienced the impact of dictatorships and military rule and exploitation. And they will, as Ottilia also said, they will keep their governments to account. So whereas we see a democratic regression maybe in the West and elsewhere, I don't think we are seeing that in Africa, where democracy is flourishing. And it provides a vehicle for, I think, a future way of governance on the continent.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the book because you have this sort of sense that democracy is decreasing around the world, but not in Africa. It's an interesting point. All right, let's end off with your slide on what difference your 11 interventions might make according to your projections. If we do everything that Jakkie and Ottilia say we must do, what do we get?
Thanks. I'm just pulling that slide up, Tim. So as we were saying, I model various interventions in the book. And the sum part of those interventions is an Africa that grows from 2.9 trillion size of its economy to about 7.2 on the current path, or about $11.1 trillion in the size of the combined, I've called it here, close the gap scenario. And by 2023, you see an Africa that is really accelerating in growth. And I'm often asked the question, so which of these 11 scenarios that I present have the biggest impact? Now, the best way to look at Africa is not Northwest, East Africa. It's in actual fact to look at Africa in terms of low-income Africa, low-middle-income Africa, and upper-middle-income Africa. And on the left-hand side of the slide are the 11 interventions that I model. Demographic dividend, what's the impact of improved water and sanitation, education, agriculture clearly, and my grandmother could also have told you this, has the biggest impact on low-income countries. Social grants, over time, becomes negative in growth because it's not an investment in growing your capital and so on. Made in Africa, industrialization, and leapfrogging are the two scenarios that across all income groups have the most positive impact on Africa. And if you're a low middle or an upper middle income countries, implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is the third most powerful strategy or orientation that you should have. The other factors, silencing the guns, democratization, foreign direct investment, aid and remittances, also have a positive impact. But those scenarios, agriculture, industrialization, leapfrogging, and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area do better than any other. But eventually, there is no magic bullet. All of this has to happen if Africa is really to undergo a growth revolution.
Jakkie and Ottilia, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thanks to Brand South Africa for supporting this webinar. If there's any sort of final comments you'd like to make, please do. But there is just a note that there is an offer to buy the book, which is on the offer section of this webinar. But it's been really a fantastic chat. Thank you so much. Sorry about the little technical snafus. They are part of our lives now. We just live with them and move on. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Cheers all. Bye.